So I think it's when we talk about the climate crisis in the global south, it tends to brush up against so many other issues that it definitely assumes a very distinct and different sort of tone, and kind of brushes up against concepts that might necessarily not really have parallels in the global north.
Okay. So I know you say it doesn't have parallels. What in what way do you think that? Trying to find a way to say this, but like you said that it doesn't have parallels in the global north. What's your perception of how the differences maybe in between how the global south and you guys particularly deal with it and versus how it may be seen in our part of the world? Do you have?
Well, so again, I think like when I say parallels, I think it's not as neat as that either, because if we're talking about, say, race and environmental, like, well, not like pollutants and exposure and race in the US, that's definitely something that's like quite easy to observe, where communities of color are more likely to be exposed to certain sorts of, to like living next to industrial areas and things like that. So I wouldn't say it doesn't quite have parallels, but I will say in terms of like public consciousness, it does seem like I said, a lot of the people who would be at the forefront of feeling the effects of climate change are not necessarily the people who have the luxury to think it through in those terms, because I think they're thinking it through in terms of like very sort of immediate issues.
Questions that come to
Alina,
mind
do you
are,
want to chime in?
I know you said that you're still in the learning process of how you as artists and as creatives and as people who are part of an organization relate to the climate crisis, but what is, I want to ask, what is your association as it stands? And also to lead on from that, also what do you see artists doing? Obviously you've had this project that you've been working on, and what are you seeing coming up through these artists' workings? So first question was how, so at the moment, where does your kind of understanding of climate crisis and your association with climate crisis and climate change stand?
So, like I said, like Khoj has a sort of history of working with a lot of what we would now call socially engaged art. Although when Khoj began in the early 2000s, they sort of referred to it as community art. And I think when Khoj sort of forayed into community art, it was a little bit open-ended, but as they started working with different communities across India, more and more, the focus sort of started to get tangled up in all of these different things, including the climate crisis or including ecology as a concept, which then of course ties back into our changing landscape. And I think one of the major sort of inflection points was this project that Khoj supported from 2010 to 2014, that basically it was called Negotiating Routes, Ecologies of the Byways. And what it aimed to do was to examine the infrastructural changes taking place across India. And I think this is also one of the key sort of things where the global north and global south differ, in that most developed countries are not in a position where they need to necessarily like provide electricity to, whatever percentage of their population, or provide very basic infrastructural services to the country, whereas the country like India is still not fully, I mean, it may be an economic powerhouse in some ways, but there are so many disenfranchised communities within who still don't have access to very basic things like, sanitation or like, literal roadways and electricity. So there is always this tension between ecological damage and development, and in some ways the two are pitted against each other. And there's quite a long history of this as well, with when India becomes independent, like what sort of development people wanted to see. emerging out of it. And I mean, that's a debate. In the end, like, of course, capitalism wins out
Of
and
course.
brings forth everything associated with it. And then when the Indian markets open up in the 90s, that again brings in this wave of development, including large scale infrastructural projects. And in India, most infrastructural projects tend to favor a very particular few and usually end up displacing indigenous, tribal, or rural communities. So,
Mm.
what this project, Negotiating Routes, was aiming to do was to follow the sort of length of one of these large scale highway building projects, and look at and sort of take a site specific approach to understanding what was happening at different sites where these large scale infrastructure projects were planned. So kind of manifested through a number of different things. Some of it was about collecting oral histories and in archives of landscapes, but also of indigenous medicinal knowledge and other forms of knowledge that were being challenged by this sort of development. Some of it was examining histories of women and tribal-led movements to sort of preserve. I don't know if you're familiar with the Chipko movement, but it was a large-scale sort of environmental preservation movement in which um, women sort of led this initiative to literally become like body barriers between people who wanted to log where
Wow.
they lived. And so, I mean, there are these histories of people at the grassroots level really contesting this vision of a very particular kind of change. Um, and this Khoj project engaged with these histories and came up with all sorts of forms ranging from like radio stations to archives of folk songs to um, these projects that engaged with different knowledge systems.
Focus,
Um,
yeah, focusing on the archiving and recording and
mhm,
of these knowledge systems, right? Of these, like the Chipko movement, the women were very much a part of that forest, the Champa lands. And, for them, those trees meant everything. It was like, it came with like a sacred, they had like sacred ties to it. Many of them were married under those trees. Uh, and they had like a whole, there was so much like indigenous knowledge that came with it about whether they were like cattle rearers. There were stories about how you know like the forest also gained from people moving through it with their cattle, like tigers would consume cows, and shepherds were fine with it because at some point the tiger was dependent on the shepherd to lead them to the water pool because they couldn't like smell water. And there's all these stories that uh, surrounded this, and also art also made within the the village, folklore around it, stories. So there were just so many things that came together so beautifully. And then it sort of like commenced no, it sort of like concluded with this really elaborate tribunal of sorts. Do you want to explain that, Nidhi?
yeah, so I think a large part of the work that Khoj does is operate through this idea of testimonies of
Okay.
of like ecological change, of the climate crisis, of like these spaces where encounters between sort of two contesting worldviews and knowledge systems happen, especially in the sense that when we talk about the climate crisis, and I think this also maybe answers why we think art is so powerful. But like when we talk about the climate crisis, more often than not, um, the conversation either happens in this very technocratic scientific language of like measuring, say, how much the temperature is increased or by how many centimeters the sea levels are rising, or
Mm.
I mean, it's a language that can sometimes be inaccessible to people who don't speak it or who haven't been educated in a certain sort of like knowledge system. And I think increasingly the second way we talk about climate crises is through a very polarized political lens, especially I would say in the US, where or in places where climate denial is also part of a larger political ideology, and that's very pervasive, and it makes it so fraught to talk about even your embodied experiences of dealing with like a changing planet. And so for us, the third way to do that in some sense is through this category of testimonies, which is to think about the body as like a site that senses change, that like lives through these changes, and that has some degree of um, almost like a sensorial archive of living through different landscapes. Um, and I think a sort of extension of thinking about testimonies is also thinking about alternate knowledge systems, which is where our work with archiving and recording Indigenous systems comes in. And I think it's also the direction that we're hoping to take with our future projects, because I think it's increasingly important to imagine different sort of registers and vocabularies to talk about the climate crisis in a way that makes it sort of tangible and real,
Yeah.
and not just abstract or something that's happening at the level of policy or science, you know, because there is this distancing effect that sort of language tends to have, and especially in terms of like inducing affect, or in terms of like connecting personal life experiences to a larger and collective history, or a larger and collective sort of unfolding of changes. So for us, that's been a really sort of central thing about imagining art's place in speaking to and through the climate crisis. And kind of taking that forward, like Alina said, we are currently working in collaboration with TVA 21 on a project that once again wants to examine air pollution, but also the transboundary aspects of air pollution. And again, one of our projects is with an artist collective called Sarab, comprising of two artists who are based in Karachi, Omar Wasim and Shahana Rajani. And they are looking at something very similar to the Negotiating Roots project. They are examining the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is also this super large-scale infrastructural project that cuts through Balochistan and a lot of areas where, again, it brushes up against like these communities that have no sort of voice in its refusal. They don't have that sort of political agency. And of course, with a project of this scale, there is a lot of ecological change and damage. And the way that Sarab are approaching that is by looking at sort of like their entry point is looking at folkloric beings called jinns that are part of Islamic mythology.
Wow.
Just because also there is a kind of political dimension to these things as well. Like speaking as a human being and a citizen against a project like this can actually get you in a lot of trouble. So you have to find oblique ways to give and record testimonies. And for them, the jinn serves as that figure that allows them to articulate the changes happening, because they are using the jinn as the site that those changes are affecting, instead of, you know, coming out like straight out saying what's happening to communities and people around there. Because again, like, you have to be a little strategic when, you know, when you can't necessarily take dissent as a right that you have without repercussions. So I guess like it's complicated to talk about, you know.
I think that project sounds really interesting, because I think you obviously have spoken about how a lot of the time language around the crisis is like removed from people, And this artist sounds like that at the same time they try to remove it from the people that are making this language inaccessible, but they're doing it in a way that means that people can understand it through a way that really connects with their backgrounds. I think that's really powerful. That sounds really, could you send me a link to their work? 'Cause that sounds absolutely incredible.
Yeah, I'm just doing that right now.
Yeah, oh, wonderful, thank you. So that's what, so is this one of the artists that you're working with on this project at the moment then?
Yeah. So their work will be on TVA 21's platform in December.
Right. So I'm just going to take a quick look as well. Go for it. Sorry, carry on.
No worries. So I guess like what I'd say is that most importantly, like I think for us, like the sort of speculative ability that art has to kind of to not just like describe what's happening or represent what's happening, but also to like be really free with imagining alternate futures. That's really, really powerful. And that's kind of where, along with this idea of like gathering different testimonies that wouldn't stand in like, if you're talking about public policy or if you're talking about legalities, but that do seem to connect with people. That's like one thread we're looking at. And then I think the second one is like the sort of power that art affords in being able to imagine an alternate future that, again, like that seems difficult when you're sort of still talking from, say, a disciplinary standpoint of, yeah, I mean, I don't know. When you're talking about like the concrete sort of issues, you know, because it's very easy to feel bogged down and like everything is extremely bleak. And I think art and literature and some degree of narrativizing does afford you the ability to imagine a different future.
Wonderful. So has that come up a lot in artists' work that you've been looking through these applications like alternate futures? Do you feel like that's a way to kind of alleviate the issue as well as tackle it at the same time?
So I think it has, in some sense, been coming up. I mean, even the Jinn project, like, it does allow you to sort of step away from the human world in some sense, which does give you a little bit of wiggle room then to think about like bodies and how they may live in a different sort of landscape. And I think like, I feel like, yes, it does. But then again, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's very easy if you're working with the climate crisis to be enmeshed in the bleak like worldview as well, like a bleak sort of landscape. But I mean, I will say that a lot of so another artist that we're working with, Abhishek, he is doing a degree of this speculative moving back and forth. And in his case, like I don't know if this is a good imagining of a future world, but he's basically traveling back in deep time to like when like, you know, mammals that relied on oxygen weren't even a thing. And it's in some sense like that sort of traveling back and forth in time also gives you this perspective that reminds you that like that life on Earth doesn't necessarily equate human life, which can be somewhat sobering, but also like thought-provoking in its own way. And yeah, which is why I wasn't sure if that falls into like a hopeful imagining of the future, just like imagining a world in which the only things alive are things that don't need oxygen to breathe. I don't know if that's hopeful necessarily, but it definitely is something that makes you think.
I think it's not necessarily hopeful in some ways, but I think it is an interesting. Well, it's kind of talking about like, I know, because I link it in with like when we go on space exploration, for instance, and we look at how other beings are like, we're desperately searching for oxygen levels, and there's also the speak of like maybe different planets have had oxygen levels before, but then environmental changes happen, and it is like it's not necessarily, I don't know if I would say it's hopeful as well, but I think it is attributing to the fact that like the planet can continue to exist even if we don't continue to exist. I don't know. That's what that it kind of, I feel it ties in with that kind of narrative of like the Earth being its own ecosystem and that it can adapt and change for itself. And I think maybe calling to people to kind of understand that like we are changing the system. It can be changed. We can try and change it back, but like it's yeah, I don't know, momentum. I'm trying to work it out. I think it's really interesting. It is a bit bleak in some ways, but I think it's thought provoking as well. It kind of makes you question your place in this environment, and if oxygen is a necessity for this planet to survive. It's a necessity for us to survive, but not for absolutely everything. Then there was a time when that wasn't a necessity. So yeah, I'm rambling about it though, so I really like it.
Yeah, I guess it unsettles the sort of central position that humans tend to occupy in a lot of discourse around like saving the planet.
Yeah.
But in terms of like being associated with a call to action, it may not necessarily be the most. I think it's just like a good sort of sobering reminder, like you said, that like the planet may continue to exist, but you might not. So
it's sobering. It's putting us in our place to an extent. I don't know.
I think the three of us seem quite delighted about this non-oxygenated planet.
I don't know. Yeah, I know. I feel like I'm smiling a lot, way too much for this kind of conversation. I don't know. I have to like. I kind of like the apex of someone thinking between like perceived futures and historic notions of like what the planet is and can be. Yeah, and it doesn't, and the fact that it doesn't involve me is obviously sad, and I'm still smiling while I'm saying this, but but I think it's a rational kind of conversation to have. It's like rather than it, like we said, we as humans, we naturally center ourselves, and we have for centuries centered ourselves in a conversation of the planet and the universe, and this artist like decided to like take us out of the equation. Yeah, and it's sobering. So you've given me so much that this is a different kind of wavelength than I thought I'd be going on at like 11:30 in the morning. Yeah. I'm having an existential crisis on Zoom. So I'm going to dive into another question. So I remember you talking earlier about the kind of the intersectionality of especially in terms of like air pollution. I remember you talking about like how it can be quite a gendered conversation. Do you want to elaborate on that? Because I think one of the questions I had was about how these kind of issues intersect with the community as a whole, or you can like hone in on one section, but yeah, how does that intersectionality, how does that come into play in terms of climate crisis and how it affects the community?
So I think this is also like fundamentally a question about how Indian cities are, in that they tend to have sort of enclaves of sort of like, if you went to a middle class neighborhood, it would look entirely different from a working class neighborhood. And I think that, of course, like changes how you negotiate, you know, say like exposure to air pollution, all of that. And I think in India, like, yes, air pollution, outdoor air pollution and indoor air pollution were sort of inherently gendered because of how a lot of times like men were the people outdoors and women were the people indoors. So, and of course, like that's a very simplified sort of articulation of that. But yeah, I think like I think in a city like Delhi, for example, which is where we do most of our work, even Khoj is situated in what's known as an urban village, which is basically um, what used to be an actual village until the city sort of grew around it.
Right.
So it still has narrower lanes. It still has very different buildings compared to the city that has grown around it. And then when you have like a lot of different sort of communities that are living in very different sort of, like, I guess almost like physical structures, um, it it's very difficult to have like a blanket conversation about all of them like they're the same. So I think even I mean, there's been a lot of research done on um, how something as simple as like the temperature of the city changes in terms of hyperlocal like areas. And because the low income areas in Delhi are so sort of stuck in together, the temperature there is almost always 1 or 2 degrees higher than a more sort of less dense part of the city where typically higher income people would live. Um, that's kind of insane. And that's also
Yeah.
true of air in some sense, because air is also like connected to temperature and also to what else is around it. So I think these sort of cartographies, when you start thinking about them spatially, like they do play into how different communities um, sit at the sort of confluence of a lot of different issues. Like you said, intersectionality being the word you use here. Like, not everybody is accessing, um, not everybody is sort of being exposed or accessing things in the same sort of flat way, even if they live, like, say, within a kilometer of each other. So I think that's something, and I think that's also something that we are invested in exploring as we take this project further, is thinking about like um, sort of unequal cartographies. And again, like I said, our main um, focus is on the idea of testimony. So I think it's very important for us as we continue working on both socially engaged art and as well as art that ties into social and ecological justice, to kind of unpack that these things don't mean the same thing for everybody, and that there is an element of, like Alina rightly said, caste and class and gender, that is kind of informing how different people deal with different things. And in some sense, for us, our commitment then is to choose artist projects and to work with artists and sites that kind of help us unpack that. And unfortunately, this project has coincided very neatly with the beginning of the pandemic. So
Yes, of course.
we haven't really been able to work as much in Delhi as we would have liked. So that's something that we're still dealing with. But I do think that as we go forward, this idea of engaging with different sorts of communities in Delhi, and how their view of the same thing sort of shifts depending on their on their other sort of um, like, I wouldn't say identities, but the other sort of groups they belong to, the other sort of geographies they occupy. Um, that's kind of something that we are interested in following.
Do you want to talk to me a little bit about how far you've come so far? I know obviously the pandemic has slowed a lot of things down, including this project. Do you want to talk to me a little bit about how far you've gotten in this project, and do you have any findings so far? I know you haven't been able to work in Delhi as much as you'd like, but I know you've gone through the selection process. Do you want to just talk to me a little bit about that?
Alina, do you want to chime in?
Sure. Yeah. So as of now, we've just selected our artists, and we've had like preliminary discussions with TBA 21, the people working there, the curator Soledad, and just sort of we had a very recent meeting with both Shahana and Omar, with the technical team of TBA21, to just work through their presentation of how do they see their work being presented on the website eventually. And then, they were walking us through how they've just gone out of the field. So, they're sharing pictures of their field visits, so we're also constantly putting those up on our Instagram and sharing it widely, because I mean, we just thought it would be good to for people to see that the process of how these artists are working, especially through the pandemic. And yeah, and the sites that they're going to are so like magical and so surreal, because of the landscape is so different from what we're used to. And it's pretty like deserted. And they're also talking about the jinn, and there's so much like surreality happening at one level. And we're just really talking through that. We haven't yet started working full-fledged with Abhishek yet. um, we're just in the process of also choosing our Delhi artists who want to do a more public on-site site-specific work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, we're basically just talking through those, and we're hosting our first talk, our series called On Air. It's a talk series with people, with interdisciplinary experts, basically across the board, actually, from activists to scholars to urban planners to artists. We're looking at bringing them in conversation together and see what comes out of it, and to just further our own understanding of the historicity of air. And how do these ways then become ways to visualize it in some way.